Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled Weighing Regulations, the Metrics of White House Review. We're so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Libby Dickinson, and I'm the Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speaker of the Federalist Society. Our moderator today is the Honorable Paul Ray, who serves as the Acting Director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. You can find out more about today's moderator and panelists at fedsoc.org. That is fedsoc.org. And with that, I'll hand things off to you, Paul, to get things started.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Libby. Thank you all for joining us. We have a very exciting panel today. Joining us are two incredibly distinguished panelists who I want to introduce right away. First is Don Kenkel, who is the Andrew Dickson White Professor of Economics in the Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell. His research and teaching interests are in health economics and benefit cost analysis. In fact, he's a former president of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. From 2018 through 2020, he served as a senior economist and then chief economist on the Council of Economic Advisors. We also are very privileged to have with us Susan Dudley, the OIRA administrator in the George W. Bush administration, the founder of the GW Regulatory Study Center, and a public policy professor at GW. She also is a past president of the Society of Benefit Cost Analysis. So Don and Susan are two of the leading authorities in the nation on benefit cost analysis, and they're here to talk about tremendously important changes to benefit cost analysis and how they impact lawyers and litigation. First of all, a few remarks just to situate ourselves. Obviously, the new Trump administration has made regulatory reform one of its key policy issues. That's been visible probably most of all in DOJ's actions, which have received kind of outsized attention in the last few days. Trump has also reissued many, I believe, all of his previous executive orders on regulatory reform, and indeed has doubled down on some of them, including changing the former 2-for-1 order to a 10-for-1 order. That is to say, requiring the rescission of 10 regulations for every new regulation issued. Now, all those developments have been have grabbed headlines. Less important, or well, less newsworthy, but equally as important, is reform of OMB Circular A4. Now, sometimes people say that OIRA is the most important office you've never heard of. Well, OMB Circular A4 is the most important OMB circular you've never heard of. It's the circular that governs agency benefit cost analysis, and of course, agency benefit cost analysis is often the decisive factor in agency rulemaking. In November of 2023, OMB issued revised guidelines in Circular A4 for regulatory impact analysis, and in February 2025, Trump directed OMB to revoke the 2023 changes. The panel here is going to talk about the 2023 changes, about the import of the rescission of those changes, and the impact of all those things for lawyers. But first of all, let me toss a question out to both panelists. Why is benefit costs relevant for lawyers? And I say that presuming that we have an audience of mostly lawyers on this webinar.
Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Libby and the Federalist Society for hosting this. So benefit cost analysis has had a key role in regulatory decisions for decades. And when you think about it, what's the alternative to basing your regulations on an understanding of the likely impacts? Is it, intuition? Is it whatever interest group has the most power? So presidents since Carter have required agencies to look at the costs as well as the benefits of their regulations before issuing them. So it's an important component of regulatory impact analysis that we're going to talk more about, I think, today. And the principles for doing it, for the requirements for agencies to do it, is in President Clinton's Executive Order 12866. So that has lasted since 1993. Each successive president has continued to rely on that. And that requirement is to ensure the benefits of your regulation justify the costs. Now, a few statutes require them, many don't, but even if it's not explicit in a statute that agencies should base their decision on looking at costs and benefits, courts are increasingly expecting them to do that. So probably most significantly was Michigan v. EPA, where the Supreme Court looked at language that said set regulations that are appropriate and necessary to protect public health and the environment. And they said that you can't decide an action is appropriate and necessary unless you look at the costs relative to the benefits. So that weighing of costs and benefits is important. In fact, Cass Sunstein has written about the cost-benefit state, that we are now in a state where courts and agencies and even Congress is expecting it. Now, as we'll talk about, some or many of Trump's actions are norm defying and disrupting. But with respect to the requirement that agencies conduct regulatory impact analysis and the role for benefit cost analysis, he has retained longstanding practices.
Yeah, I really like Susan's first comment that, if not benefit cost analysis, how do you make decisions? I mean, whenever I get into these conversations, that's, flip a coin. I'm not really sure what the alternative suggestion is, but, benefit cost analysis is a tool been developed by economists and the legal profession as well. From the economic perspective, it's a tool to evaluate whether regulations fix market failures and improve economic efficiency. And what's really nice there is that it looks at both the costs, because sometimes fixing a market failure can be very costly, and you have to balance that with the benefits of fixing the market failure. And you also have to think about all the possible unintended consequences. And benefit cost analysis provides this really nice systematic way to, put all those impacts together to a framework to say, well, are the benefits greater than the cost? Is this an improvement in economic efficiency? And I think we'll be kind of coming back to that over and over. But I mean, the broader context of exactly how they plays out in different, with the executive orders and through OIRA and everything, I think Susan has already spoken well to, so I'll stop.
Well, thank you both. That's very helpful. So one question I have for you following up on that is, one lesser discussed part of the 10-for-1 executive order is a regulatory budgeting provision. This carries forward a provision from the 2017 2-for-1 order. So what role, if any, does benefit cost analysis play in the regulatory budgeting world?
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the executive order became known is known as to the 10-for-1 rule, just like in the first Trump administration was the 2-for-1 rule. And you said double down. I guess that's quintupling down, actually, isn't it? But counting up the number of of old regs that have to be deregulated for every new one, that's one way to think about these rules. But the regulatory budget is really, I think, the heart of that rule, and that says that has some kind of a requirement on what total cost of all new regulations and deregulations on net creates for the economy. And in the first Trump administration, the first year was it should have no net cost, zero net cost. In the new rule, the 10-for-1 rule actually said it should be significantly less than zero. So net cost savings. And so that certainly shows, well, obviously part of the cost benefit analysis is there. You're looking at the regulatory cost. But what is also really key is that, again, both the first and now the second Trump administrations, the guidance documents very clearly require that this is conducted together with the benefit cost analysis of every regulation and every deregulation. And so it doesn't supplant, it doesn't remove those requirements, it just adds to those requirements. And now this gets, you have to get your head around it for a second. How do you do a benefit cost analysis of a deregulation? Well, the benefits are the cost savings, the regulatory cost removed because you've taken away this regulation. That's the benefit side. And now the cost side of deregulation is that we're giving up the benefits that the regulation used to create. So presumably, even if it's a regulation or a deregulation that passes the benefit cost test, there's still typically opportunity cost of, hey, we're giving up some public good that was created by this regulation, but it didn't justify the cost of that regulation. So, it's kind of the flip side of saying a regulation doesn't pass the benefit cost analysis, a deregulation does pass the benefit cost analysis. Now, at the same time, you can't just sort of put negative signs and flip everything over. The agencies have to conduct new analyses to see, given the current status of the world, given new data, new evidence, does it look like this regulation or this deregulation, are the cost savings actually greater than the benefits? And so that's how they're layered on top. And this is one of the ways where I guess, especially in the first Trump administration, that this, I don't know if it was exactly an ever quite norm busting. I mean, actually, ever since the Carter administration's Council of Economic Advisors started a conversation about regulatory budgeting. And it's been used in a lot of other countries, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. And so, and the UK as well. What has been tricky, I think, is sometimes it's the totality of regulatory costs is so large that the idea of saying, okay, here's a regulatory budget, here's totally how much cost the regulations can impose on the economy. That measurement problem has shifted our attention to what we refer to as an incremental budget, regulatory budget. And that is, okay, we're not quite sure how much costs are out there, frankly, but we can say something about the new cost being created by new regulations and the cost savings created by deregulating old regulations. And so that's how this regulatory budgeting is working. It's an incremental budget, an incremental regulatory budget. And, there's some tension. I mean, I can certainly imagine that with benefit cost analysis, I mean, the directive to find regulations to cut and to save, I mean, that could be implemented by deregulating, taking away really good regulations. And by really good, I mean regulations have more benefits greater than costs. But when you combine it with running the benefit cost analysis of the deregulation as well, that should keep that from happening. And it also addresses this concept, this problem that a lot of people have noticed, that of cumulative regulatory burden, which again, that dates back to the President Clinton's executive order as well, that agencies should be considering about the fact that they're layering regulation over regulation, but a lot of times one at a time benefit cost analysis of one regulation doesn't really capture that. So that plus also a retrospective review. It really forces the agencies and now DOGE to look at the body of regulations and try to figure out, which ones might be good targets to deregulate and generate cost savings.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, go ahead.
Do you mind if I just jump in and add
Yeah,
something?
please.
Yeah, because I think that's all right. In an ideal world where we had perfect information about consequences of our government actions and perfect incentives to maximize public welfare, benefit cost analysis on its own might be sufficient, and a regulatory budget might seem unnecessary and wrong. But neither of those are true. We don't have perfect information, and the incentives aren't necessarily always in the public interest. So, agencies' incentives may be, they tend to have tunnel vision and focus on their particular issue, and therefore think that the benefits are much bigger, and discount the cost. So I think it does address that. And as Don said, and this is in an ideal world, it would provide an incentive to actually look at the regulations that are in effect and determine whether they're actually achieving the benefits that we predicted. We tend not to do that. We tend always just to predict new benefits and then move on to the next regulation. So just to supplement what Don said about that a regulatory budget isn't necessarily anathema to the requirement for benefit cost analysis.
And
I'll also point out, by the way, the regulatory budget doesn't have to be less than zero. And as a matter of fact, the executive order says that in future fiscal years, when I said it was significantly less than zero, cost reduction, that was for fiscal year 2025. The executive order specifically says in future fiscal years, OMB will tell agencies what their target is, and that target could say positive regulatory costs are warranted given what's on your regulatory agenda.
And if memory serves, in the first Trump administration, there were in fact agencies that in given years had positive regulatory budgets. By the way, I should apologize. I'm going to be sneezing a bit here. For those of us with allergies, we can verify T.S. Eliot's line that April is the coolest month. So thank you all for bearing with me.
We should add, I think, Paul, you introduced us, but we should clarify that you were OIRA administrator during the first Trump administration.
Oh,
So
yes, that's true. That's true.
implementing that regulatory budget, the two.
Yes, that's right. That's all extremely helpful. Now let's talk a bit about Circular A4, which is the heart of the debate that we're here to talk about. So, what is Circular A4 and what's its provenance? Susan, you're pretty well set up to talk about that.
Yeah, I liked your opening comment about it being perhaps one of the most important circulars that you haven't heard of. I think more people maybe have heard of it now.
That's right.
So it was first issued in 2003 in the George W. Bush administration, but that circular was built on guidance that had been from the Reagan and then Bush and Clinton administrations. So each of those administrations incrementally built on the earlier administration's guidance. What made it a circular is it went through notice and comment and peer review. So that was a part of it. So the focus of the previous guidance and the circular was on net social benefits, that economic efficiency lens that Don talked about just now. So why it's topical right now is that in 2023, the Biden administration revised it, also going through notice and comment. And with the goal to, they talked about it being a modernization, that the circular is 20 years old, it needed modernizing. And some of the changes I think were worthwhile, and appropriate, but it also, in other places, their concerns were raised, I'll use the passive voice, because it was a dramatic shift from that economic efficiency lens and the traditional goal of benefit cost analysis to provide a transparent accounting of what we know about the consequences of regulation, the benefits, the costs, the intended, the unintended, and then allow policymakers, they don't need to make their decision based on the option that looks like it has the net benefits. There may be other factors, but that's what the RIA should provide them. So OIRA received a lot of comments, including a letter from all the former presidents of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, of which Don and I are in that club. We raised concerns about that. We made that point that some of these are worthwhile, but there are other changes that really do move regulatory analysis and benefit cost analysis away from its traditional purpose.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I also mentioned, just as someone who's taught benefit cost analysis for many, many years, I really loved the 2003 Circular A4. I thought it was a great document. The textbook I was using, I actually used an option of actually having that sort of included in the textbook as an appendix, and I would constantly refer to the students saying, so here's how the textbook is saying, and basically the exact same thing is being said in Circular A4. And then again, this 2023 revision did a lot of good things. I mean, the idea of modernizing makes sense, and I think also to some extent I know a lot of people from the agencies and OIRA worked on it. It helped, just sort of incorporate some things they realized would be useful guidance just from 2 more decades of experience. doing benefit cost analysis of regulations. But the shift really was, quite fundamental, of this idea that the economist had, a very big question, I think, does economic efficiency, does a regulation improve economic efficiency? And in that, it's very specific that, we're using very precise definition of what we mean by economic efficiency. And it boils down to, well, virtually every real world regulation is going to have winners and losers. And the question comes down to, can the winners, at least potentially, could the winners compensate the losers so everybody be better off? And that's the same thing as saying, are the benefits greater than the cost? And that's the question about economic efficiency that traditional standard benefit cost analysis addresses. But notice that it doesn't say anything about who wins and who loses in that. And that's always been noted as a limitation of benefit cost analysis. And, the seminal works in the academic work say, yeah, we don't think that's an unimportant question. In fact, we think sometimes it might be the most important question. It's just not a question that economists have expertise in terms of the value judgment is, how do you make that trade-offs? How do you decide when this is important enough to go past the have an economically inefficient policy that is still worthwhile because it achieves these other objectives like improving the distribution of income or addressing racial justice, social justice issues. And the 2023 revisions took a very specific approach to answering that question, which is, again, actually very old in benefit cost analysis research. And it really moves from this narrow question of economic efficiency to this much broader question of social welfare. Will this change improve social welfare? And in particular, by making things more equitable. And to judge that, they introduced the idea of distributional weights, weighting a benefit or a cost based on the income level of the person getting the benefit or receiving the cost. And they have a very precise formula for it. They have a very precise parameter value to plug into that formula. And what it results in is weights that would say that like $1 to someone in the lowest income quintile is worth like 40 times more than $1 to somebody in the top income quintile. And that could therefore justify a regulation that totally fails economic efficiency. In fact, you could have like 95% loss of economic efficiency in the sense of, imposing cost on the rich and giving them to the poor, giving benefits to the poor. But this weighted benefit cost analysis would conclude such a regulation does improve social welfare. And, there's return to the sort of the I guess, humility of economists, hopefully we have, is that we can judge the benefits, whether the benefits of the cost in general outweigh, whether the benefits outweigh the cost or vice versa. But making the value judgment there, and it's also, I think, by the way, sort of very non-transparently putting a value judgment in a formula being used by analysts at the agencies is not the best way to make that decision. And so it's better to, if, we think we can, the economists now, I'm saying, we think that we can provide, evidence on the efficiency of a regulation and then let democratically accountable decision makers weigh these other factors with this. And so our regulators, we hope we, provide useful information, but we don't make the decision.
Don, can I project on that point? I think that one thing economists can do is maybe look at the benefits and costs by different groups. So you can definitely provide decision makers information, because you certainly wouldn't want to pursue a regulation that, even if it had huge net benefits, that benefited the wealthiest individuals and harmed the lowest income individuals. But that actually often does happen. Regulations can be quite regressive. So that kind of information is really valuable, and economists can do that. But as you say, it's the embedding of,
Yeah.
of those values in what should be a transparent analysis is what the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. If the revisions in 2023, I think they did, Circular 84, I think they did do a good job of emphasizing that, yeah, economists can do that. The agency should be talking about the distribution of benefits and costs much more than they do. They just stopped there. I would have been all on board.
Yeah,
But when they went the next step is when they lost me.
Yeah, so one point that both of you have made, I think it's a really important one, is that benefit cost analysis it was never meant to be a kind of policy algorithm where you put in the right numbers and out pops a policy and you just you the agency just sort of follow the guidance of the algorithm in making policy. Rather, it was meant to be a tool that equips policymakers to make sound political judgments. That's what I hear both of you saying. And so sometimes there's this criticism benefit cost analysis that it's a kind of it results from a kind of default from policymakers um, to bureaucratic decision makers employing some sort of algorithm. But what I hear you both saying is that just to the contrary, benefit cost analysis is what allows policymakers to make informed decisions that effectuate their policy goals. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. I'm kind of smiling at my own history of teaching. I think the first couple of times when I was a very young assistant professor, I more or less told students it was an algorithm. And experience, both with teaching and with thinking more harder about it, made me realize that, yeah, benefit cost analysis can't be an algorithm that you just plug into a computer, but it informs, helps decision makers make more informed decisions.
Yeah, Sally Katzen, who was a wire administrator in the Clinton administration and the lead author of the executive order that still guides today, she often says it's informative but not dispositive.
Right. And that was certainly my experience as well. Yeah, so we've talked about a couple of seminal moments in the history of Circular A4. One was 2003, one was 2023, but another is surely February of 2025 when the president directed OMB to revoke the 2023 amendments and go back to the 2003 amendments, or a version rather. Now, there's been a criticism of uh, of that directive that it basically that it prejudges uh, what the standards should be for benefit cost analysis, when in fact the statute under which Circular A4 operates, that's the Regulatory Right to Know Act, requires requires peer review for those standards, and there's peer review in 2003. There's peer review in the 2023. Well, I guess I forget if it was late 2022 or early 2023, but a peer review that resulted in the issuance of the November 2023 amendments. But there's not been peer review of the rescission going back to the 2003 version. So keen to hear y'all's thoughts on whether peer review was statutorily required to go back to the 2003 amendments, and whether regardless of whether required by statute, whether it would have been a good idea to seek peer review.
So we're not lawyers, Paul, so we may come back and ask you that same, what you think about that same question, but I'll give you my non-lawyer answer. And that is that the peer review really didn't support some of these key changes. So for example, that weighting, the peer review did not support that. It did not support a very low discount rate, which maybe Don can talk more about if people are interested. So there were several aspects of it, and some of the ones that I think this is the former presidents of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, several of whom were peer reviewers, by the way, raised in our letter and in their comments. So if the Trump administration asked me, which they did not, I think they could have, and maybe they still could, say, we actually looked at all the comments you received and the peer review feedback that you got, and we think that supports the 2003 version more than it supports the 2023 version. So I think that would not require a new notice and comment period and a new peer review, because I think the existing one really does support the old version more than it does the new version.
Yeah, I don't think I have to have much to add to that. I mean, I agree that it was quite disappointing to see the final version of the 2023 revisions. And though, as I, sort of read all the peer review comments and as well as the public comments like I submitted, I realized that I was not in the minority, that, a lot of people, experts, more expert than I am, agreed with a lot. We agreed on a lot of points, and a lot of those points disagreed with the final version of the 2023 circular A4. The distributional weights was one. Choosing a single relatively low discount rate was another one where, that could have a huge impact. The issue about whether benefits should be counted globally versus just domestic benefits, the guidance there, I think was, again, sort of treated that as a more cut and dried issue than it should be, given, sometimes the statutes are pretty clear that U.S. laws are designed to improve the welfare of U.S. citizens or U.S. residents, usually, not just citizens, but and yet that doesn't really follow through some of the A4 guidance. And so those two things alone, by the way, the discount rate and the global versus domestic, those basically drove the difference between the Obama and early years Biden administration's estimate of the social cost of carbon, which is like $40 a ton. And then in the first Trump administration, when they recalculated it using the guidance consistent with the 2003 circular A4, which was in place at the time, the social cost of carbon drops to $7 a ton. So these sort of what might seem like arcane differences can lead to very big differences in a key estimate like the social cost of carbon or social cost of greenhouse gases, because those drive so many environmental and energy policies. And yet in that circular A4 revision, they didn't fully really incorporate a lot of key comments made by lots of the peer reviewers.
Yeah, and I'll just to be devil's advocate, because we don't have anyone on this call who is a strong supporter of the revisions. As I say, I think both Don and I and a lot of people did like some of those revisions. So, but it's a few very important key things that we raise concerns about. So I think supporters would say, yes, they did listen to peer review and they did pay attention and they did make changes. If people are interested in diving into that more, you can obviously look at the peer reviewers' comments. There's a packet of those, but one of the peer reviewers and also a former president of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis and editor of the Journal for Benefit Cost Analysis, he did a comparison. He looked at all the peer reviewers' comments, quoted from them, and compared that to the final. And the title of his paper is Consensus Ignored. So he certainly found that they did not. And that's available as a working paper on the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis website and will be published soon in the journal.
Well, those remarks are really helpful. Thank you both. Don, actually, my next question was going to be, could you give some illustrations of the kinds of regulatory policies that are of the way the difference between the 2003 and 2023 versions might shape the discussion of different policies. But I think your point about the social cost of carbon is right on point there. So I'm not a panelist. I'm really the moderator. But I will say that I think the provision of the Regulatory Right to Know Act that's in question here is it's quite short. So I'll read it to you. The Director of the Office of Management and Budget shall provide for independent and external peer review of the guidelines, and each accounting statement and associated report under this section, and then some other language that's not relevant here. So the requirement in the Regulatory Right to Know Act is to provide for independent and external peer review of the guidelines. Now, to my mind, that leaves open quite a bit of discretion on the part of the OMB director as to how to provide for such review. And one way I would think of doing so would be to, as Susan suggested, to look at the comments that were offered, just a couple of years ago on the 2003 version and the proposed changes to it. I would think that those comments would be, fully as informative of the recent decision to go back to the 2003 version as they would have of the decision to go forward with the 2023 version. So I'm inclined to think that satisfies the regulatory right to know requirement. But again, I'm not a panelist here. So
the Trump administration need to say they did that. So the director of OMB simply revoked the circular pursuant to presidential memo or executive order.
yes, that's right. So the administration did not expressly state that. That's right. I think that it's worthwhile stating that. So I guess I want to open it up for either Don or Susan to offer any last thoughts here before turning to the audience for questions. I see we have a number of questions already lined up.
Yeah, let's go to the questions.
Yeah.
All right, great. Let's jump into it here. All right, so from Rick Belzer, we have the main alternative to benefit cost analysis is benefit cost analysis run by special interests. And he says that that's what the 2023 revision legitimized. The question remains, will OIRA staff be empowered to enforce the 2003 edition of Circular A4? So it's a question about the practical realities of OIRA review in the second Trump administration. But so let's begin to answer that question by talking about what OIRA's role implementing Circular A4 traditionally has been. So Susan, you're the natural for that question.
Either I am or you are. You can supplement.
Sure, I'm also happy to do that. Yeah.
Worked with with a deregulatory order and initiative.
Yes.
Yeah, OIRA wears several hats in the review, excuse me, in the review of regulations, both proposed and final regulations. And one of them is what President Obama called providing a dispassionate and analytical second opinion on agency actions. And that part really does try to hold agencies' analysis supporting their regulations, especially their regulations that are likely to have impacts, either benefits or costs of 100 million or more in a year, to the requirements of Circular A4 and the principles of that executive order. The other two hats are coordinating across agencies, and so that also provides external to the issuing agency input on what the impacts of their regulations are and maybe whether there are better alternatives to achieve the goals. And then also accountability within the White House. So OIRA is a staff of career professionals, a small staff, we might add, about 50 career professionals, but they are part of the executive office of the president. And so they do work closely with the policy officials in the White House. So it adds that presidential accountability. So to Rick's question, does that presidential accountability mean, can that overrule what a benefit cost analysis might say? Perhaps. It wasn't, in my experience, when I was OIRA administrator at the end of the Bush administration, that did not happen a lot. But when it did, the OIRA staff recognized that the president is elected and we're not. And so sometimes that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll just add that, OIRA's regulatory review function is purely a creature of presidential directive. OIRA itself exists because Congress created it in statute, but its regulatory review function is purely a function of executive order. And that's important because I don't think it's possible to conceive of effective regulatory review other than as than as flowing from the directive of the president. At the end of the day, the agencies are, well, they're accountable to many stakeholders, but to the president most of all, and appropriately, in my judgment. Um, and so any kind of regulatory review that stemmed from some source other than the president is just going to be, I think, likely to generate into a kind of box checking exercise, right? The agency may feel obligated to comply with due to statutory requirements, but wouldn't actually inform agency decision making. Benefit cost analysis is likely to inform agency decision making in practice only if agencies think the president and his top leadership think it should, right? And so it's, to my mind, very important that OIRA is a White House office and not some other agency in the federal system, and that historically it's had the support of the president of the West Wing in enforcing the requirements of EO 12866 with respect to benefit cost analysis. I think Susan's right that you can imagine a situation in which the president's priorities are so either predetermined or urgent that it doesn't leave any space for benefit cost analysis. And I think it's too early at this point to know whether that's the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
even in those cases, I think the analysis still is useful information to be presented, even if the decision is based on other grounds.
And why would that be?
I was going to interject that the fact of the analysis being required and that OIRA will be eventually checking it over, and I guess also I'd say maybe even more so with the incremental regulatory budget, the 10-for-1 rule, gives a lot of incentives to the agencies to try to get things right ahead of time. And I spent one of my sabbaticals visiting the group that does the benefit cost analysis at the FDA. And the person that was running that group explained that a lot of the value he thought in the whole requirement of benefit cost analysis was the fact that economists were working with the other groups at the FDA in developing the regulations and saying, another group would say, well, we think we need to regulate, for this type of address this issue, but they'd start working on that regulatory impact analysis and the benefit cost analysis with the economists, and the economists would say, well, is that this particular feature of your proposed rule, is it creating a lot of cost? Is there a way to achieve that without quite so much? And he really felt that there was so much value of the benefit cost analysis process leading up to the actual benefit cost analysis that I wouldn't I don't want to overemphasize that, but I think it's very much there. And it also fits in, what are the agency's incentives? And that's where that incremental regulatory budget, if agencies, I think for very good reasons, you are trying to follow the mission of their agency. If you're in the EPA or the OSHA, you're trying to help produce the public good of environmental safety, health, occupational safety. And the fact that you're required to come up with these, cost savings from deregulations gives you this incentive, well, to do as much good as I can. I want to get rid of the really costly regulations and deregulate some so I can either pass new, better regulations. And I think that kind of gets the incentives right. And that even gets the incentives right if you have, sort of more a self-interested group view of what the bureaucrats are doing in the agencies. If they're always going to want to try to, do, I think they'll have strong incentive to try to do as much good as they can, either out of self-interest or out of public interest. And that regulatory budget is a way of incentivizing them to do that.
So Susan, you made a point just now that I wanted to to circle back to briefly, you said that you thought that benefit cost analysis can be important even if there's already been a political decision at high levels about about the policy. So why would that be?
Because it helps them understand what they're trading off. It's easier, well, it's harder to make a policy based on intuition if you know that there are some consequences of that you had not thought of. So I think it just helps them. Yeah, I mean, and then there may be decisions, this is worth it. We're willing to make that trade-off. And there are good reasons for that. For example, as Don pointed out earlier, benefit cost analysis doesn't consider distributional impacts. And yet we do a lot of our regulations are intended to provide safety nets for people who are deserving. So, but doing that analysis still is valuable and can help you make sure that you take your action in the most cost-effective way, in the most efficient way, even if it doesn't maximize net benefits.
So here's another question from Rick Belzer. And Rick, thank you for sending these. He said in the first Trump administration, OMB demanded that agencies offer regulatory impact analyses for major deregulatory actions, even where the authoring agency didn't perform benefit cost analysis to justify rules in the first place. And that, pardon me, and that requirement basically resulted in slowing down rulemakings. And so he wants to know if there's a solution to this problem.
Well, Paul, I might toss that one to you, given the president's
Fair.
to take not to go through notice and to be able to use legal arguments to avoid notice and comment. Is that relevant to this question?
I think it might be. So let me just say, offhand, I can't think of a situation in which, at least in my tenure, in which in the first Trump administration, OIRA required benefit cost analysis to rescind a regulation that had been issued without benefit cost analysis. But it may well be so that there were such rulemakings because we didn't typically ask whether the agency had undertaken benefit cost analysis to issue a rule. We wanted to, quite regardless, we wanted to undertake benefit cost analysis to see if rescission of the rule would be cost justified. And I think all else equal, that's the right approach. The fact that there was a defect in a rulemaking doesn't automatically mean that in rulemaking to issue a rule doesn't automatically mean that rescission of that rule is cost justified. So I think the question should just be, is it is the agency likely to benefit from benefit cost analysis in the case of a particular rulemaking, and is the public likely to benefit as well? Now, Susan, you just mentioned a recent executive order by President Trump about rescinding regulations without notice and comment, and the order directs agencies to rescind regulations without notice and comment when the regulations are, I think the term is clearly unlawful under Supreme Court case law, and the order lists several cases under which regulations might be clearly unlawful. These are all cases from the last few years in which the court has made some pretty important changes to administrative law. And so, I think that order it doesn't tell agencies to rescind regulations without conducting benefit cost analysis. It just says to do so without notice and comment. But of course, it's in my experience pretty difficult to cost analysis if you don't do if you don't take comment, because normally public comments are provide the material to conduct your benefit cost analysis. So I think it's fair to say that that agency BCA will be, if undertaken at all in cases in which that executive order is invoked, will be pretty thin. And it may well be that agencies dispense with benefit cost analysis altogether. In those cases, though, again, that's not required by the order. I guess what I'd say on that point is, in cases in which a regulation is plainly unlawful, that is to say, the agency has no choice but to rescind the regulation because the existing regulation violates the underlying statute or the Constitution. I would say that the need for benefit cost analysis is probably at its low ebb there, because the agency knows what it has to do, no matter what the benefit cost analysis indicates. The agency's authority, the statute and the Constitution, require it to rescind the regulation, even if BCA says that doing so will result in untold preponderating costs, right? That far exceeding benefits. There's still a benefit to BCA even in that situation, because it could be helpful to the public to understand the costs of the source of law that is requiring rescission of the regulation, right? If there's a statute that an agency determines requires it to rescind a regulation, it could be helpful for the public to understand the costs that statute is imposing by requiring rescission of the regulation. That said, one of probably the main reason for BCA is to guide the agency's exercise of its discretion. If the agency doesn't have discretion, then the need for BCA goes down, even if it's not eliminated. So that's what I'd say on that point. But keen to hear from Susan and Don.
I was actually going to go on just a slightly different category of that type of thing. Is that sometimes the benefit under executive order, Clinton's order 12866 rule, set out conditions that a regulation either required to go through notice and comment and the benefit cost analysis, or did not. Especially the regulatory impact analysis, not the notice and comment part. And I think that's part of the value of that 10-for-1 part of the 10-for-1 rule, as well as the incremental budget, is that there could be a lot of regulations out there that were never conducted benefit cost analysis to begin with. And yet the agencies might have a pretty good idea that they're not working right, or that they're not very valuable. And they can be counted in that 10-for-1, in the 10, as some of the deregulations, even though they're not kind of contributing to the incremental cost budget calculations. And this is a way of kind of getting rid of the underbrush of, these sort of, worthless or even costly regulations. I mean, I think one that I guess a number of us noticed during the first Trump administration was the frozen cherry pie standard. That for some reason the FDA, dating back to the 1970s, had issued a very precise set of things that you had to do to be able to call yourself a frozen cherry pie if you're a manufacturer. And there's never any clear benefits to that rule, and there probably weren't very clear costs either. But getting rid of it is sort of this idea of a cumulative burden of regulation, that if you wanted to enter that business, that would be one more thing you would have had to have worried about. And that was actually, but I guess that anecdote kind of ends maybe with, I think, some of the tension that's going on here with a lot of this notice and comment rulemaking, is that frozen cherry pie standard, I saw it, the deregulation fairly early on in the Trump regulatory agenda during the first Trump administration. It was finalized during the Biden administration. And so it took years, and the Biden administration agreed that this was a pretty worthless regulation. But I think that's a lot of those are the issues. I mean, benefit cost analysis takes time. Regulatory impact analysis takes time. As Paul pointed out, the notice and comment period can really provide useful comments to improve the benefit cost analysis. Takes time. And I think there's some impatience out there with trying to get things done faster, and then really can work with the, unless, I'll just stop there. I'm afraid I'm going to wander into making legal judgments that I don't have the expertise to make.
I'll I think Don's frozen cherry pie example is a good one. The CFR is just full of requirements like that. I am put in mind of one agency uh, who came to the White House one day to announce that it had discovered four requirements still in the books in 2020 that required regulated entities to report via telegram. The last telegram was sent in 2010. There are no telegram companies in the world, so presumably regulated parties have not been complying. But nevertheless, it's it's very problematic to have requirements like that are forgotten, but that regulated parties have to decide on their own volition to disregard. Right? It's quite antithetical to the rule of law and dampens economic growth and market entry. So the agency was happy to rescind those requirements. But I think of that story as kind of standing for the idea that probably just about every agency has arcane requirements that it issued decades ago and forgot about, and until it has a reason to go back and look, it's not going to. All right, so we have 2 minutes left until 12:30, which is the end of this webinar. So we have time for one more question, and here's a question from Zach Hale. Zach asks, how will we know the current administration is actually implementing or achieving the objectives of the 10-for-1 order? What will we all be watching for in that regard?
Yeah, that's a good question. So and it is going to be hard because the 10-for-1, I'm sure that they'll meet it because they'll be able to define what's a deregulatory action and what's a regulatory action in such a way that they can finesse the accounting. The other part, as Don said, is going to be more binding, the actual cost offset. So each year, OMB is supposed to issue a report on the benefits and costs of their regulations. So in a year, we'll see what that report says. But I think all this will be taken with a grain of salt. What do you both worked in the Trump administration. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I know that the OIRA, has also, separately from the benefit cost report, also sort of had an accounting statement every year about exactly how it was doing on the 2-for-1 rule. And again, the counting up rules, regs and deregs is sort of the easy part. The harder part's the incremental budget cost savings. And the hardest part is, have we really deregulated the most important things to deregulate? It's almost impossible to know. I mean, I think and that's not something that the administration is going to be able to definitively say or not, but I hope that academics will continue to provide that outside voice of, hey, it looks like here's what was achieved and what wasn't achieved by this rule.
Yeah, that tallies with my experience as well. I found that the cost budget is really drives agency action more than the ratio requirement. That was the case under the 2-for-1 order. I have to imagine it's the case under the 10-for-1 order, especially given that if memory serves, agencies can comply with the ratio requirement by rescinding guidance. Agencies have just troves of guidance from over the decades that often enough they don't bother to rescind. I think I want to say on the Department of Labor's guidance portal right now, there's something like 9,000 guidance documents listed, right? I have to imagine that the agency, if it set about it, could rescind hundreds of those in pretty short order and could use that rescission to meet the 10-for-1 requirement pretty well. But that wouldn't be very useful in meeting the reg budgeting requirement unless it can show economic benefits from the rescission of those guidance documents. So yeah, I tend to agree that the more important provision of the 10-for-1 order is actually the cost budgeting provision, and we'll have to assess how agencies do on that through the ORB reports. Well, oh, go ahead, Don. Yeah.
I was just going to say, one thing that's true too is that one deregulatory action can have huge cost savings, like the Cafe Standard Safe Act, a lot of the net regulatory cost savings of the first Trump administration are accounted for by one action. So when you're looking for those significant costs, look at the big regulation, big deregulations.
That's right. That's right. Well, we are here at the end of our time together, so I want to thank our panelists, Don and Susan. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to the audience for being here as well. And we hope to see you soon. Libby, over to you.
Great. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Paul, for moderating, and thank you again to Susan and Don for joining us and for sharing your insights today. For more content like this from the Regulatory Transparency Project here at the Federalist Society, discussing the regulatory state and the American way of life, please visit us at regproject.org. That is regproject.org. Thank you.